my fixers in Ukraine was like obsessed with it.
Isn't that
just,
like
did it all the time?
Like a smokeless e-cig? Isn't that the whole point though? That you want to go and blow it out and everything? That's kind of part of the whole appeal, though.
You get smoke from the like stick, but it's not like the cigarette's not on fire.
Yeah, it like heats the tobacco to release the nicotine in the tobacco and a little bit of smoke at a lower temperature than actually burning it, because it's like an electronic thing. So you're not inhaling as much of like the tar and the paper and the like just straight up like carbon in like the smoke or whatever. And it smells different. It doesn't smell. It smells like a weird cross between like fresh tobacco and burning tobacco. My fixer just like chain smoked on that shit. And a ton of people have those.
When we got to Berlin in December, I wanted to get like something, and I went in, asked if they had any vapes, and the shopkeeper was like, "Oh yeah, these are really popular. You might like this." So she like sold it to me, and there was like blackberry and strawberry flavored like cigarettes, quote cigarettes, that came with it, and they're kind of like Camel Crush. Like you had to like pop a little ball, a flavor ball inside them.
I haven't seen the flavored ones.
I brought it home. Like I brought the device back to the States, but like nobody sells those like cigarettes here.
Yeah, you need like a special width of cigarette.
Yeah, it's tiny. It looks like it's like the width of a Virginia Slim, but the length of like a standard like Marlboro. It's interesting. How did we get on? Oh, vapes.
Yeah.
Vaping.
The classic icebreaker. It's funny because like I don't smoke tobacco or I'd vape nicotine or anything like that. I'm just a weed guy. But now that's lame. Now it's not. I mean, maybe it never was cool. I don't know. I guess at some point it was kind of counterculture, but now it's not even that. Now it's like just like a normal thing just a lot of people do.
I want to go on record in saying that I have always been anti-weed. I've always been a marijuana abolitionist. I think it's the devil's lettuce, and I don't think it should be legal. Right. I think all other drugs should be legal, and weed should be decriminalized. Like no one should be sent to prison for dealing weed or owning weed, but you should be sent to prison for associating with any kind of weed paraphernalia, wearing T-shirts with weed slogans on them.
If you have one of those posters with the alien, the black light stuff. All that. Yeah. Instant gulag.
Yeah. Well, not like gulag, like re-education. Sure, you should be re-educated away from being a stoner, I think. Right.
And I think that's the thing. It's like when it becomes a part of your like personality, then that's not good.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
We were in Colorado last week, and my partner wanted to go to a dispensary because she smokes. I do not. So we went, and I was just kind of checking out everything, and like all the guys working there who were nice, but they were all just fucking
dispensary
fried.
Guys,
just totally fucking fried. And it's like how I was just thinking to myself, like how do you live? Like how do you function day to day? Because it was just again, they were nice, but they were just like very slow and just like totally spaced out. It's like I mean, I guess this is a perfect job for you.
Yeah,
but I don't get it. I haven't gotten it since I was like an 18-year-old and like stopped smoking when I was like 20 or 21. And just like don't miss it at all.
You don't see that in like people that work in liquor stores or anything. Just completely wasted all day.
I don't know, man. There's a beer store near me where one of the employees is like. But I haven't been there a couple of years. I stopped drinking too, but she's like clearly a functioning alcoholic.
Yeah, I spoke too soon. Jack, so I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to come this. I know you got wedding stuff going on. You're saying you got to be doing a bachelor party. You're doing journalism. Yeah, I'm really happy that you carved out the time to come talk to us on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, guys.
Congrats on almost being a wife guy. You're almost there.
I can't wait. I'm counting down the days. Early October. It's gonna be great.
Very nice. Yeah, no, it's kind of funny. It's like we've gone a few weeks without doing an episode. We had one of our guests kind of fell through last time. Jordan's been kind of traveling around. I got COVID, so I've been clinging on for dear life the last week. I thought I was going to go out like Stan Chera. But
you can't go out like Stanchera, man.
No,
you gotta at least put up a fight. Wasn't there a thing I saw online that like the Chera family is like doing a fundraiser for Trump or something like that? Like I think it was like Felix from Chapo or something like that tweeting like go out with the Cheras or something. But I think like the Chera family, they're real, and they are my friends.
Yeah. That's definitely one of the classic Trump moments from the later years, the later period Trump moments. Yeah, I definitely don't recommend getting coronavirus though. We've been through a whole multi-year period of this, and I got to say it's really, really as unpleasant as advertised. And
is the new variant? I've heard horror stories about the new variant making people like really like sick to their stomach as well, which is like my worst nightmare.
Yeah, I've had a lot of really bad nausea. Really rough. Yeah. I think I was someone that, it's been over 2 years, and I think you kind of get lulled into a sense of like complacency. You tell yourself like, okay, if I would have had it by now, or if I'm one of these lucky ones that has my, my amazing genes or whatever is preventing me from having the worst symptoms of it. But when I got hit by it, it was like, oh, okay, wow, this is really not cool. And it's been a pretty rough week over here. I'm still, I'm mostly just like I've elevated back to like a place of just normally feeling like shit. But
it's been incapacitated.
Yeah, it was a couple of really, really rough days where I was like pretty miserable. So happy to be on the other side of that now. So and then again, this is the kind of sacrifices I make for podcasting and content. I'm here regardless.
Yeah, and it's like a very, physical job that you really got to just be like in peak performance for. So well, glad you're feeling better. So yeah, what do we got today?
So Jackie, you were in Ukraine again recently, weren't you?
Yeah, I was there for 2 weeks in the beginning of June. I was writing, sort of reporting out a long feature that actually hasn't published yet. It was a pretty short trip because I was only there for 2 weeks. So I kind of just like was focusing in on one story and doing all the reporting for that. Spent about half of the time there kind of in Kiev in the capital, just sort of like hanging out with people, but mostly like kind of doing the logistics work and stuff. And then the second week, I was out in the east, in the city of Kramatorsk and a bunch of the surrounding villages that are now kind of one of the flashpoints. There's like kind of two major front lines at the moment. And so a lot of those towns and villages in the east are in a lot worse shape than they were when I was there. And when I was there, they were, still already starting to get hit. So yeah, that's sort of my last trip. A lot of it as well, like it takes about 3 to 4 days, I would say, to get from New York or anyone else into like the country where you're going to do reporting, just because you have to fly either through Poland or through Moldova. So there's just really not an easy or quick way to travel around the country anymore. So doing all that takes a lot of time.
What was it that made you get over there in the first place? Because you were there at the exact moment that this whole conflict kicked off, right? Like what was that process like, and what made you want to, be over there in that kind of fraught and dangerous situation?
So I had covered Ukraine back in 2015. Basically right after I got out of grad school, I flew over there and just kind of started freelancing. I actually basically lived over there for the better part of a year, for most of sort of like early summer through winter of 2015. I think I left in like late November of 2015. So I had been there in the past. I don't speak Russian, but after living there for a while, I knew a lot of people in the country, and had was at least more experienced than most, sort of better versed in that conflict than most, but very much was not an expert by any means. So when this most recent kind of build up hostilities really started dominating the news cycle, I just kind of reached out to most of my editors that I was doing like politics writing for and stuff, and was like, hey, I have experience here. I'm going to just pay my own way out. I'm going to do a trip, probably be out there for like 2 or 3 weeks. Do you want to take some pieces about, what it's like in this country, given this like massive military buildup? When I did that, it was kind of like, I probably wouldn't have booked the tickets if I didn't, have some inkling that something was going to happen. But once I was there, I was really swinging wildly back and forth on a day-to-day basis as to whether or not an invasion would happen at all. And most of the people that I was speaking to at the time, especially in Ukraine, and Ukrainians did not think it was going to happen. I think sort of the worst case scenario that people expected was kind of a limited military engagement in the Donbass and the east, for Russia to basically come in and formally occupy their so-called separatist republics that they'd been effectively occupying their proxies for the past 8 years, but like formally occupy them and maybe try and push the front lines back. But nobody, I think, really thought that what happened would happen at the scale that it did.
Yeah, we just saw a story in the Post today that even Ukraine's leaders didn't even buy it, and they didn't think it was going to happen. And it detailed how the United States tried to warn them, and they struggled to convince them this was likely going to happen. But I remember the general sense of disbelief. I think I didn't think it was going to happen. I'm just naturally distrustful of the U.S. intelligence community. And I think a lot of people were skeptical until we saw it. And I remember talking to you, Jack, the night it was going to happen, and you pinpointed a 2 to 4 hour range when everyone you were with said it was going to happen, and sure enough, it did.
So it was interesting because I of course share your deep skepticism of the U.S. intelligence community. I think in hindsight, what we should have known, because for all of its faults, in certain contexts, the U.S. general intelligence apparatus is extremely good at what it does in some contexts. And I think looking back on it with the gift of hindsight, what I and many people thought was happening was that the U.S. government was being deliberately alarmist in order to sort of preemptively call Russia's bluff, and hoping, I think, that if they said, we know you're going to do this, we know you're going to do this, it would make them back down. I think the Ukrainians' impression of that was that, the U.S. was being alarmist and they didn't expect anything to actually happen. But I think, in hindsight, there wasn't really any incentive for the U.S. intelligence community to lie about that, if that makes sense. I remember at the time there was some sort of some of the dominating wisdom among skeptics was the U.S. is warmongering. They're trying to draw us into another war. But the rhetoric from the Biden administration was very much we don't want any part in this. We in NATO will act they were talking about material aid and et cetera, et cetera. But they had drawn a very clear line that we're not going to put boots on the ground. This is not a war that we want our direct forces to get drawn into, et cetera, et cetera. So it wouldn't really make sense that they would be pushing this war unless they really had something, I guess. And it was still, a shock. That Wednesday night that you're talking about, that was after Putin had sort of given this big speech. And what had happened on that night is all of the major news outlets, I got a text message from one of my buddies who works at the New York Times, and he was like, our whole team and a bunch of shifts of breaking news guys just got sent home. It's 2 p.m. in New York, and they were go home, get 5 hours of sleep or whatever, and report back to the newsroom at 9 p.m. for invasion coverage. And it was because all of the, from what I heard, all of the major news outlets got a readout from, U.S. government on that. I think it was that sort of Wednesday morning in the U.S., Wednesday morning, Wednesday afternoon, that said to an extreme degree of specificity, here is where and when it's going to start. And before that, all of their warnings had been it was sort of, it was Boy Who Cried Wolf. Like all their warnings were like just vague, like invasion is imminent, like they're going to do this and this and this. But
it was kind of a couple of weeks of that.
Right. It was weeks of that, which definitely like, yeah, there was a Boy Who Cried Wolf effect there, that when it actually came, those of us who were like paying really close attention could tell that this one was different. But I imagine for a lot of people, it was just like, oh, okay, they're just saying it's going to happen again. Yeah.
Part of people's disbelief, and even within the Biden administration, from what we have learned, was that the time and the scale of the attack just seemed unrealistic. Like, this was in the middle of the winter. It was a huge endeavor. And a lot of people thought like, oh, he's just trying to, ruffle his feathers a little bit, because, you could point to that just being a standard annual military exercise as cover for prep. Yeah. And having all those people stationed there. Could you give like an example? Could you give people a description and a better understanding of just how monumental of an undertaking that was, with this goal of toppling Kyiv, and kind of what day-to-day life is like there now? Because this is kind of faded. I mean, aside from, some coverage here and there from like the wires and people who are still there, it definitely isn't at the forefront of a lot of Americans' minds as it was a couple months ago. So could you give people an overview, in addition to that size and scale thing, just what you've seen when you were there just in June? What day-to-day life is like now?
So there were very much sort of like two phases of this invasion, as it was. The one that began at the beginning was basically the worst case scenario of all worst case scenarios that the U.S. government had been warning about. And that worst case scenario was that it would be a wholesale ground invasion, that there would be, all the crazy like Atlantic Council rhetoric, tanks rolling over the border. It's like all of that literally happened. Like that's just literally what happened over every single border point where they were massing, down from Belarus, up from the Belgorod region in the east, up from Crimea, in from the Donbass region and everything like that. There was a massive ground invasion. And I don't think anyone really expected that. And I think that sort of element of surprise and the very quick overwhelming force is why it made it kind of as far as it did. And there was that immediate thrust for Kyiv, and this sort of immediate thrust for a bunch of major cities. The most surprising thing after that, though, was really how quickly that endeavor failed. And that has to do with a whole bunch of different things. I think it has to do with the fact that the Russian military is far more poorly organized, poorly equipped, and, just less competent than basically every analyst in the West and in Russia assumed that they would be. It was that the Ukrainian forces performed far better than they were expected to, and it was that even the sort of like meager Western aid was really sort of rose to the occasion in the types of fighting that was happening early on in that war. And then what you saw in about I guess this was mid-April at this point. I think let me sort of just check. This is when the Russians kind of started pulling back wholesale. This was early April, and that's when the narrative of war crimes and everything like that started to come out, because as they were leaving these areas that they had like very quickly occupied, we were finding out more and more about like the horrific things that happened there. But essentially what happened is that they pulled back and they regrouped, and they started a very, very different kind of military campaign in a lot of the country. And to a certain extent, what began in sort of late April, early May is still the phase of the conflict that we're seeing now. And in my opinion, is what we're going to see consistently for the next, I have no idea how long. And that is basically very slow advances by Russian forces under the cover of massed artillery fire and airstrikes when it's possible. And there's going to be no more sort of like tanks sprinting down highways toward Kyiv. There's going to be no more anything like that. It's just going to be a very, very slow war of attrition of them just pounding whatever village, territory, anything like that is within range of their artillery systems. They're just going to bomb it as much as they can and move in slowly behind them. So for people, to your second question, for people who are living under that, daily life is, I mean, in a lot of these places, it's almost non-existent. There's kind of a process of what happens to these towns. And you can kind of see them in different stages of this process when you're down there. And the first one is when they're, kind of outside of enough of the range. I'm speaking about these towns that are along the southern front and in the eastern front, in the east, specifically around the biggest major city is Kramatorsk. And what happens is at first, most of these towns kind of empty out. A huge amount of the people leave. I spoke to one guy when I was in Kramatorsk this last time who said he lives in an apartment building with, I think he said something like 60 different flats in it. And of those, only 5 of them are occupied right now. And just driving around Kramatorsk is like, it's an absolute ghost town. The only people on the streets are military. There's like a scattered handful of like maybe cab drivers or the occasional civilian. But they're really, really empty. And that's in the towns that aren't sort of in direct range at that point. And in the ones that are, what you see is the people who are still there that really don't have anywhere else to go, or the people who are just in a state of like adamant denial that the war is ever going to get so bad for them that they're not going to be able to continue living there. Which can be a strange sort of mix of people. Obviously, it's a lot of older people who are stubborn and don't want to leave. But I've also seen, young families that are still just out there because they have a home there and they have a business, and that they really don't want to leave no matter how bad it gets. And that, I guess that's sort of like the second stage of things. And then the third stage of things is when the bombardment gets so severe that all you really have is people living in basements. And at that point, if they haven't evacuated by then, sometimes it's possible to get them out. Other times, these are people where there's often in cities like we heard in the news weeks ago, Severodonetsk was the one that was in the news, and then it was Lysychansk, which is next to that. Now it seems like it's sort of Bakhmut, which is south of Kramatorsk. I was there a couple of times in June, and it was kind of in like the ghost town stage of it. There were artillery strikes there kind of daily, but it wasn't under widespread bombardment. But I've spoken to people who were in like Lysychansk when it was under, heavy bombardment. And that's when like these towns just basically sort of ceased to exist. And there might be people still living in basements there. There might not, but slowly like contact gets cut off. When I was out there in Kramatorsk, there were groups of aid workers that were running evacuation missions to Lysychansk on a daily basis. And oftentimes like people who were refusing to evacuate but were in basements, and they were like physically just like running messages to and from them so that they could communicate with their loved ones, because there was no service, there was no anything. They couldn't come out of the basement for long enough to like go and try and find phone service or electricity or something like that. And there will be, that's a small subsection of the population, but there are those people in basically every occupied area along the front line, everywhere in the country, or everywhere along the front lines in the country right now. And I mean,
yeah,
it is kind of surreal, because general life in the rest of the country is back to, I don't want to say normal, but it's like, it is remarkable how kind of resilient everyday life is. Like when I was in Kiev, like the bars are open, the restaurants are open, people are out on the streets, people are going on dates, there's concerts in the park. Like life kind of springs back into those places extremely quickly once the immediate like danger is gone. And it's even like that in some places that are, maybe 100 miles, sometimes even like 30, 40, 50 miles back from the front line. You'll go kind of like you'll be in these like bustling like sort of cities. I judged it when I was driving there and out. Like when you get to a place where like the traffic lights are working again, you're like, oh, things are like pretty normal here. But then eventually you go and that you'll drive through a town and all of a sudden like, there's no traffic signals, like, and then there's nobody on the roads, and it kind of feels like you're just sort of like falling off the edge of the earth the further and further out that you get.
What's it been like for you as someone not only like reporting on the ground in Ukraine, but someone that's spent time there in the years previous, seeing the coverage in the West of this and like in terms of what Western media coverage gets right, what they get wrong. I think when this kicked off, we did a really good podcast episode with Kelsey Atherton, mm-hmm. who and we talked a lot about the sort of context surrounding it there, with the understanding that like, trying to understand the history and trying to understand the context isn't really justifying the war or suggesting that it's okay, as you yourself have experienced, whatever altruistic reasons Putin or anyone else uses to justify any kind of war, inevitably horrible things happen and crimes are committed and women are raped and all the terrible, terrible things that happen in any war. But I think in the West, it's been kind of odd how there's been this kind of relentless need to suggest that this just began in February and to really downplay all of the context of the last 10 years and the role that the West has played in kind of adding fuel to this fire over the last 10 years. Has that been like strange for you, or like how do you kind of square that circle as someone that's actually spent time there and spoken to people there?
Yeah. It can, there's kind of a different couple of different camps in the media, all of which are, sort of annoying to me. I guess I sympathize with some more than the others. You do get sort of like the context list. Yeah, this all began, on February 24th. This is this horrible thing that Russia has done. We must like #resist this, Ukraine flag and bio, et cetera, et cetera. I get that. And I think it's good to a certain extent that any person with like any grasp of understanding of how the world works or anything like that can look at Ukraine and be like, oh, this is a large militarized nation that invaded another sovereign nation. That's an abject wrong. Like there is no, like you can't like justify that, and it's good that people can recognize that and can, be able to identify who the primary antagonist is. That does, I think, what bothers me in war sometimes is kind of like abject cheerleading. I wouldn't begrudge any Ukrainian, even for like feeling sympathetic and toward their own military and wanting to like cheer on the actions of their military in this context. Like their country has been invaded. That makes sense. I think that does bug me a little bit more when I see Westerners who don't really have any skin in the game, like doing that and just sort of like memifying like the Ukraine war, because that's just not. That's not how I like to experience or process war. And as far as the West's like involvement in fueling these flames, I think there have been some really good sort of like academic and policy wise discussions about the roles of Clinton's decisions to expand NATO and how that sort of drew Russia into the place that it is, where it, feels that the only way to pursue its own security goals is to be, openly hostile and aggressive to all of its neighbors. And I think there's some very good sort of points in that. But the other side of that context is Russia has been deliberately violating the sovereignty of Ukraine as a country for more than 8 years at this point. Crimea was annexed in 2014. That was the annexation of a piece of land that was owned by one country and then relatively bloodlessly another country said, no, that's ours now. Then there was a limited invasion in 2014 in which, there were Russian troops in Ukraine at that time, sort of fomenting the various like separatist forces, and what we called at the time, sort of like Russian backed separatist or Russian backed, militants, et cetera, et cetera. But like I was there in 2015. I lived on for a while on both sides of that contact line. I lived in Donetsk, which was under Russian or sort of Russian proxy controlled territory for several months. And like, yeah, you can like, you see the Russians that are there with your eyes, So yeah, as far as like what the US media does and doesn't do wrong, I think they cover it poorly, in the way that, CNN covers any war poorly. Like, anytime Jake Tapper sees like a digital camouflage pattern in front of him, like his pupils dilate, and like, I think that shit sucks and it's gross. But one of the odd things, at least to me, sort of as a leftist, looking at this war, is having to figure out a way to square the fact that in a huge amount of cases, and my knee-jerk reaction is to sort of oppose the actions of the U.S. government and the U.S. intelligence community and the U.S. military. But as best I can square it in my own understanding and in my own sort of like general values of what I think is right in the world, I don't find a huge amount of fault with a lot of the U.S. government's decisions, at least in the past year or so, in the past 8-9 months that this war has been happening. I think the Biden administration did the best it could given the circumstances to prevent the war from happening in the first place. And I think that their decisions since then have largely been in line with preserving the most amount of innocent life from being lost. Because I guess I don't see a compelling argument anywhere that doing something different than what the U.S. has done would have resulted in a more peaceful solution for anyone involved in this conflict, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can credit folks, whether they're progressive or anti-war, wherever they find themselves in the political spectrum. People were pretty loud and at the onset, just like vocally and loudly opposing any direct involvement in this conflict by the United States. And I think the Biden administration knew it would just be a total clusterfuck if they got more directly involved. And it would just be bad. It would be
that would be a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia, which is exactly the kind of doomsday scenario that
absolutely.
And I think people, I think to an extent, like I think the public pressure here to prevent us from getting more involved was useful. I don't know how they would have operated had there not been as loud of an outcry about it, but I'm glad they did, because there's just no way that would have helped, and people were genuinely worried about it.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was useful. I think in particular the skepticism towards U.S. arms deals toward Ukraine is useful. I do think that a whole lot of it coming from the left, unfortunately, as often happens from the left in a lot of international relations issues, was wildly off the mark and incredibly ill-informed. But I think that is going to be vital going forward in just sort of looking specifically at what our involvement is, what our commitments are, what our sort of financial and military entanglements are in the country. I think that's vital. And I think that every leftist should be paying attention to that. What has frustrated me an enormous amount in this is the sort of the lack of deeper thinking on the left as far as this war goes. I think the left hasn't really been prepared to grapple with an imperialist conflict that was not really started by the United States. Of course, NATO had a role to play in creating the security paradigm that led to this invasion. But, the fact of the matter was on February 24th and in 2014 and in 2015, the decision to create violence in these countries has not been in Washington, D.C. Like it's been in Moscow. It's been the decisions unilaterally of one person who controls the Russian security state. So, that's really kind of frustrated me. A recent example of that, the Quincy Institute published this poll yesterday or earlier today, I guess. New poll shows majority support in Seattle area for speedy diplomatic. So they polled a bunch of people in Representative Adam Smith's district, because he's been someone who's been involved in calling for Ukraine aid and stuff like that. And the Quincy Institute's poll showed that understandably a lot of people wanted a diplomatic solution in Ukraine. A lot of people were worried about it going nuclear. A lot of people saw it as negatively impacting their own finances. And they were worried about the loss of life and livelihoods in Ukraine. It seems like a lot of the rhetoric coming out of the left has been well, why aren't we pushing for a diplomatic solution? Why are we adding fuel to the fire in this war? And I think that those arguments are so deeply frustrating to me because it's we're not pushing for a diplomatic solution because there's no one to negotiate with. It's not, the Russian government is not looking for they haven't come to us with a set of demands. They haven't come to Ukraine with a set of demands other than Ukraine is an illegitimate state and we're going to denazify it. That is their starting point. So I think that some of this pressure on the West and even on Ukraine itself, which also the government of Ukraine is very much not interested in a diplomatic solution right now. I think that sort of it falls prey to this kind of classic impulse in leftist thinking recently, which is to place the United States and its actions at kind of the top of the pyramid as far as what affects these things. And I think what we're seeing is that's not true. I think everyone would love a diplomatic solution to the Ukrainian war, but that's not something that any of the parties in the Ukrainian war are offering at the moment. So I just
well, how about the whole situation with the Minsk agreements that was kind of negotiated previously? Is the reason Minsk wasn't followed, is that 100% Russian responsibility, or has there been a situation where other sides have also contributed to this lack of a diplomatic solution before this escalated so dramatically?
Largely, the Minsk agreements were a mess from the start. I think it's been reasonably well documented and again, you can call into question the motivations of international organizations like the OSCE, the Organization for Security, et cetera, in Europe or whatever. These were the allegedly impartial observers to the war for the past 8 years that have worked on both sides of the line, et cetera, which is a deeply flawed bureaucracy. But in general, the only international institution we have that was keeping an eye on this war. And just in my personal experience, the Minsk agreements were violated constantly by both sides. I think if you look at things sort of objectively, it has always been more in Russia's interest to violate them because they've had so much less to lose by doing so, and they have taken that opportunity many, many times. In a lot of these international agreements, Ukraine, I think, feels a reasonable amount of pressure to abide by them, which they don't always do, of course. But they feel more pressure to abide by them because they are more accountable to, their benefactors in the West, right? If Ukraine is violating the Minsk agreements constantly, then they risk, losing support of Western nations that helped negotiate the Minsk agreements. If Russia violates them constantly, so the Minsk agreements were a set of, like, for listeners, like, set of ceasefire agreements. There were a couple of different Minsk Accords that basically governed, like, what could and couldn't happen along the border between Ukraine and these sort of, like, breakaway republics, effectively Russian proxy states. And they had everything from, like, sort of, like, political rulings to, like, specific rulings on, like, which weaponry you can use. The big part of one of the second Minsk agreements was that you could only shoot mortars of, like, up to a certain diameter, and you couldn't use, like, tanks and heavy artillery and stuff like that to kind of keep this conflict from spilling over into wider loss of life. But I mean, yeah, it was never, Russia doesn't have anything to lose in these things. Like, they were already, now they're even more of a pariah state than they were, but, like, they don't. So they were violating these all the time. And I don't really think, you saw this in the lead up to the war as well. I was down kind of on the front lines in a town called Avdiivka a couple of days before the war started, when these tensions were really, really high. And at the time, separatist-backed forces had, like, really increased the amount of shelling that they were doing at night. And the directive to all of the Ukrainian commanders, which was really well documented in reporting, was to basically not retaliate, because they didn't want to give Russia any kind of pretext for a wider military action. And that's not always been the case, but that has been a pretty consistent kind of trend that I have seen, which is that Ukrainian forces have usually been directed to use some restraint, at least, or give the appearance of restraint, because they didn't want to escalate things. And, the other side, Russia and its proxies, did not have those same limitations at all. In the days before the war, I don't think that this war has been good for anyone involved, really. I think maybe you could take sort of like a galaxy brain interpretation that, like, maybe the, real, like, Henry Kissinger acolytes in DC, like, wanted this war to happen because it pushed, Finland and Sweden into NATO. And now NATO is stronger, like, et cetera, et cetera. But, like, it also created a, like, massive worldwide economic collapse and has, like, created a refugee crisis across Western Europe. Like, I don't think that anyone, even in their most, like, neoconservative, like, fever dream, wanted this war to happen, right? So I guess that's sort of where I like kind of lose the plot of the arguments of, like, the West caused this, or the West, like, wanted this to happen, if that makes sense.
Where do we go from here? I mean, they just, like, how do you see this developing, unraveling? I mean,
yeah.
Does Russia show any sign of, just giving up? I mean, like you mentioned earlier, this really revealed that their military was not as robust as some people thought they were. So where does this go?
Also, it's probably worth pointing out on that subject that, as you mentioned, Russia has been kind of made a pariah, at least in terms of, like, the quote unquote rules-based international order, who have really tried to isolate them economically with this big sanctions regime, which has kind of not really worked out the way that they were planning to. And it seems like it has also blowback for countries that have participated in it, like Germany, and where Russia's economy, while it's taken this as a hit, hasn't really been sort of isolated and devastated to the extent that they were hoping it would at the outside of the invasion.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There was a lot of there was some reporting, at least at the beginning of the invasion, that Putin had spent a lot of time basically trying to sanctions-proof his economy because he knew that something like this was going to happen. Moscow had, like, huge reserves of just, like, American dollars and stuff like that to try and keep their own currencies afloat. So yeah, I don't think that the sanctions have quite had the effect that the West has wanted. I sort of go back and forth as to, the thing with sanctions is it's always, for truly effective and moral sanctions to work, you have to sanction the people and the systems that like everyone in the West, like the sort of oligarchical kleptocracy in the West also thrives on. So that, you know, oftentimes you get these like broad sanctions that end up just like making the lives of everyday people miserable. And then like a bunch of oligarchs kind of go free. And I think that's happening to a certain extent in Russia as well. But, you know, where do we go? I think militarily and kind of strategically, the most likely thing is that the conflict becomes some kind of more brutal version of what it's been for the past 8 years, which is a kind of, for the past 8 years, they've used the term frozen conflict. I don't necessarily think it'll become that cool off that much, but I think what will probably happen is that some kind of sort of like equilibrium will be found, and these front lines will solidify to a certain extent. The question of where they solidify is really kind of up to the tactical situation on the ground. I don't really know. That depends on how quickly more like Western artillery systems make it to where they need to make it. It depends on a whole bunch of like different variables that I just like have no real expertise in deciphering. But I think this just becomes a slow grind, and it becomes a much wider version of what the war was before, which was a pressure point for the Russian government to influence politics and the livelihoods of people in Ukraine. And that there is this presence here, and anytime they want to make people afraid, anytime they want to make people worry, anytime they want to express their displeasure in something that the Ukrainian government does, you know, they can press on that pressure point. They can send another battalion in there. They can increase their artillery strikes on whatever, you know, military encampment or civilian city is within their range. And I think that could go on for a very, very, very long time. Because I just don't see, I don't see the Russian state backing down. And I don't know why anyone would expect, you know, the Ukrainian state to do so either. Maybe we'll get some kind of political situation where there's like a negotiated settlement or something like that involves some kind of like territorial concessions. At least from what I've seen from like polling and also just like speaking to Ukrainians, there isn't a huge amount of appetite for that. They are like reasonably and justifiably like furious that the, you know, the borders of their country have been violated again and in such violent fashion. And I think, you know, the vast majority of people in that country want the Russians out entirely. And I don't think the Russians want to get out. So it's just going to go on. I think that's kind of where we go. And as far as like, where does the West come in? I think, yeah, our weapons companies keep making massive amounts of money because the arms deals keep coming, because the arms deals are basically the only thing that is keeping the range of Russian guns contained to where it is right now. And I go back and forth as how I feel like that as, you know, as a leftist and as a pacifist, but I just don't know what other option there is. We've seen directly, you know, what happens, and I have seen in person what happens to the places and the people that come within range of the Russian military state. And I think every well-meaning person should feel compelled to make sure the least amount of, you know, territory and the least amount of people experience that.
I mean, one of the central storylines of this whole conflict that I guess it would be, we would have to bring it up while we're talking to you, is the role of these like right-wing extremist groups in Ukraine. And it's kind of tricky to talk about, obviously, because like I said, I don't want to justify any of the invasion or the violence that's happened. But I mean, this is one of the things when I started paying attention to Ukraine around 2018, 2019, because the Canadian government has also been involved in this kind of conflict over the last 10 years. And there's been reporting in Canada done of the Canadian military establishment, along with like the United States military and intelligence community, arming and training these extremist groups, which is like, that's kind of one of the things I started paying attention to this.
Yeah.
And I think like trying to hold this idea at the same time where you can believe that Putin is kind of cynically using this phenomenon to justify this invasion, and using these kind of altruistic words like using denazification to justify it, while also acknowledging that does seem to be an issue. And I guess that's the part that I find really tricky, is that, the CIA, the American and the West, NATO, the Western intelligence establishment and security establishment does have a sort of long history of arming extremists in order to have a destabilizing effect on a sort of geopolitical foe, and they did this in Central and South America. They've done this in Libya and Syria and other places. So yeah. I guess what's your read on that? And I guess that's another thing that I wanted to mention, is that the role that the Western media has played in this, it's like they've almost seemed like they've been doing Putin propaganda for him. Yeah. In that they keep on elevating these figures in this conflict, just time and time again, having images of Stepan Bandera behind them and having kind of fascist symbols and iconography. So that's where to me it gets kind of really murky. So I was just wondering, like, what as someone that has spent time there, like, what is your read on that whole narrative?
Yeah. I mean, this is another one of the things that's like very frustrating. I think because I think it's both a extremely valid and important issue that we should discuss. How the U.S. and the West's role in funding and arming groups who are ideologically, just like poisonous in whatever country. But it's also frustrating because that issue is, as you say, like often used to give cover to like a much more clear, like moral truth to the situation, which is that like one sovereign nation was invaded by another. So it's a very complicated issue. I'm very much not an expert in all of this. I can say, are there right-wing militias in Ukraine? Are there overt Nazis in Ukraine's military? 100%. Absolutely. They're all over the place. I've seen them. Everyone who's been out there has seen them. Every reporter who's reported on Ukraine has seen them. And anyone who says that they haven't is lying. Like, that's out there. I guess where that gets complicated for me is that are there like white nationalists and Nazis in the U.S.'s armed forces? Yes, absolutely. And obviously, I don't think you or listeners of your show are particularly like supportive of the West armed forces either. But I think when you look at what was happening in Ukraine before the war, these white nationalist militias, so Azov Battalion is the big one that everyone knows, rose to an enormous amount of fame because of their role in the early days of the first Russian invasion in the war. These were some of the only like groups that were kind of like armed and violent enough to push back against that invasion, and they kind of came into this sort of like notoriety. Ukraine took the step of a few years into the war, basically absorbing those units into its sort of more formal bureaucracy of its armed forces, which you can say is a bad thing, definitely. I don't think that necessarily white nationalists should be welcomed in with open arms to any country's armed forces. But what it did is it sort of limited the direct political power of these units, because it brought them in under sort of the bureaucratic umbrella of the Ukraine armed forces. And it meant that like they weren't just like off on their own with their own guns, running their own operations, doing everything. They had oversight from the government of Ukraine, which is not, I think, by anyone's sort of like any reasonable observer's opinion, a like overtly Nazi or even far right regime. Like Ukraine is I would put them as sort of like a, center right, somewhere in the kind of like, it's hard to compare them to like US politics or something like that, but very much sort of like I guess, Lib Dem center right kind of et cetera, et cetera. If you look up like the far right groups and their actual political power, like Right Sector, National Corps, government initiation of Yarosh and stuff like that, in the 2019 elections, that like coalition of all of these far right groups only won 2.15% of the vote and like failed to pass that. Like, I'm just reading straight from like Wikipedia where I looked it up on, but like these groups don't have a huge amount of like political power in Ukraine's like state bureaucracy, if that makes sense. So like, does it suck that like every time the media finds like a new like brave young fighter to like and they have like a big like Thor's hammer patch on their uniform or something like that? Like, yeah, and I think that's bad, and I think that's something that like we're gonna have to deal with in a lot of these countries for a long time going forward. And I get very disconcerted, and I don't like that when I see that in person when I'm out there. And it just drives home the point that like this war is basically the best thing for those people, because war like this empowers nationalism of all kinds. And I think that nationalism gets excused and gets by people who don't hold those same political beliefs. This is like the best recruiting tool that they could get, is a very abject and clear, like assault on the country. So, I mean, where do we go with that? I don't know. It just makes me like tremendously sad that you're going to have more like young people that slide further to the right, that get involved in nationalism in that way. And I'm like highly worried and highly, I guess worried that maybe that political power, which they clearly didn't really have in 2019, will skyrocket. I would have to look up, when the next elections are going to be. And that would be a terrible shame. I don't really think, personally, from what I've seen, I don't really think that the U.S. government providing weapons to the Ukrainian state, which is still, for the most part, a relatively functioning like state bureaucracy, against all odds. Like, there is a elected president who is, for the most part, calling the shots, I think, who suffers from the same kinds of like complicated political entanglements that any politician in a, capitalist, semi-functioning democracy does. Yeah. But like, there is still that state bureaucracy. Like, we are not funding random groups in Syria who like may go on to be like in a completely like random groups in Syria in a completely failed state who are going to go on to like blow up into something else. If the situation in Ukraine changes to where that does become the case, then I will get a whole lot more concerned about arms deals to white nationalist groups or the CIA training like far right paramilitaries and stuff like that. I think to a certain extent that is not necessarily, that's not my chief worry when it comes to white nationalists and ultra nationalists in Ukraine right now, is that they will get weaponry or training from the West. My concern would be that they get more diplomat or more domestic political power as a result of this war that Russia started.
Well, Jack, thank you so much for joining us. We're glad you made it home safe. We're glad you were able to go and report from, I think, a clear-eyed, rational, peaceful perspective. I've always appreciated your analysis and takes on foreign policy, and just really appreciate you coming on and talking to us. We've been trying to have you on for a while. You were, a
Thanks,
busy
man.
guy.
Well, I hope you're
dodging us by flying into war zones and stuff. So
yeah.
I hope your readers don't think that my points of view are too influenced by the CIA. I promise that I don't work for them. I just, when you see this stuff on the ground, it definitely affects you.
Rob's paid by the CIA, so they're already familiar with that.
We're gonna meet up in the lunchroom, the cafeteria after all this, and have a good laugh about how I'm not recording right now, obviously, but have a good laugh where we put the wool over everyone's eyes here.
Yeah.
Well done, friends, and record again.
Jack,
there we go.
Jack, where can people find your work?
I'm on Twitter at JSCROS. That's kind of where everything is.
Well, thanks again, Jack. It was great to talk to you about all this stuff.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
Thanks so much, guys. Talk to you soon.